Hello, everyone. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you in the East and in between. My name is Rob Rauch. Welcome on behalf of the ABA Forum on the Construction Industry, or Forum on Construction Law. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Verrill Dana in Portland, Maine, and I'm here today as chair of the Forum on Construction Law's Distance Learning Committee, which presents webinars for both CLE and non-CLE purposes. We are a division of the Forum's Special Projects and Education Committee, and I'd like to welcome you all here. On behalf of the Forum leadership, including Arlen Lewis, the current chair of the Forum and the Governing Committee. This is a terrific program. The challenges and opportunities women face within the legal profession, the impact of COVID-19 on our work-life balance. We've got a terrific panel here for you, and I will introduce Seyran Chelik, who will be our moderator, and she will introduce the panel and take it away. Before I tell you a little bit more about Seyran, I want to thank our friends at HKA for sponsoring the program, including Tracy Doyle and John Poulin, who helped pull this together. I also want to say a special thank you to Tamara Harrington and LaShonda Williams of the ABA Forum, who helped make this possible. Seyran is a civil engineer with a Master of Science, a degree in geotechnical engineering. She is a director at HKA and based in Miami. As an engineer and claims consultant, Seyran has worked on a variety of large-scale projects in US, Europe, Australia, and Latin America. In her current role at HKA, she provides advice to her clients on the subjects of geotechnical engineering, analysis of delay, disruption, and cost claims, both during the project and in the dispute resolution process that sometimes follows. In the current role at HKA, Seyran chairs the Quality, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for the Americas. So thanks again to the panel and Seyran for putting this together, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Rob, for that introduction. Obviously, before we get started today, I would like to thank the ABA Forum on Construction Law for kindly agreeing to host this panel session on what I believe to be a very important topic, which simply cannot be underscored enough, being the impact of COVID-19 on working women. So we are all faced with a unique combination of personal and professional variables. And with the insertion of the pandemic and everything that has come along with it into our lives, it's important to not only acknowledge it, but also talk through sort of the profound additional burdens that the majority of working women are quite simply faced with managing. And so in putting this program together, I was interested in having this conversation with women who are already operating at an elevated level within one of the most demanding fields in the professional services space. So I'm sure that we're all very interested in hearing about their thoughts and their life experiences and their strategies on how they have created sort of a sustainable work-life balance during this time and what we may all consider going forward. So without further ado, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our esteemed panel of guests. And because they're able to do so much more eloquently than I will introduce them simply by name and title and defer to them to provide a bit of a background in their own words. First off, we're joined by Nicole Stanton. She's a vice president and general counsel with Harvest Inc., and she's joining us from Phoenix. Nicole, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Seyran. Again, Nicole Stanton. I am currently the general counsel and corporate secretary for Harvest. Prior to that, I spent about 20 years at a private law firm, a large national law firm, where I spent 5 of those years managing the Phoenix office of that firm. For Harvest, I cover all aspects of their legal affairs, from compliance to M&A, We're the largest cannabis company in Arizona. We do operate in multiple states, which, as the conversation goes on, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 and the challenges that that posed for me as the general counsel. And then, of course, just recently, it's almost been a month now, I can't believe it. We did announce the acquisition of Harvest by another cannabis company to create what will be the largest cannabis company in the United States, a $1.2 billion transaction, all handled remotely during the pandemic. So thank you for having me. Look forward to the conversation and appreciate the ABA hosting the panel.
Thank you, Nicole. We're secondly joined by Ms. Tiffany Rauch. She's a partner with Jones Walker, and she's joining us from Houston this afternoon.
Thank you, Sayron. So as Sayron mentioned, my name is Tiffany Rauch. I'm a partner at Jones Walker in Houston. I practice exclusively in construction and in particular on large-scale infrastructure and industrial projects. My practice is focused on pre-dispute counseling, real time on projects, all the way through dispute resolution process, whether that's counseling clients on commercial negotiations between the parties, ADR, litigation, what have you. I am a member of the firm's mentoring committee and previously served on the firm's associate advisory committee. I am also married with 2 boys, ages 5 and 8. And I look forward to the conversation also. Thank you, Sayron.
Thank you, Tiffany. And thirdly, we're joined by Ms. Joanna Horsnail, and she is a partner with Mayor Brown, joining us from Chicago.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for the discussion today. I am Joanna Horsnail. I'm a partner in the Chicago office of Mayor Brown. I've been at Mayor Brown for 23 years as of this spring. And I, similar to Tiffany, and not surprisingly for that we're involved with the construction forum, practice construction law, but I do transactional work as opposed to Tiffany's focus on dispute resolution. And I do negotiating all kinds of design and construction contracts for projects of all sizes, but with a particular focus on infrastructure projects, public-private partnerships, and sports and entertainment transactions. I'll just mention also, I do a lot of leadership work and always have at the firm around diversity initiatives, and have held a number of roles in that regard and currently chair this firm's diversity steering board.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joanna. I appreciate all of your self-introductions, and with that, I will go ahead and kick off the discussion. I'd like to mention a couple of current research and statistics to kind of set the stage for this conversation. And what I'd like to share is actually out of a McKinsey study that has been conducted in partnership with Lean In organization. And that is, as you may have guessed, the Women in the Workplace report. Now, this is something that they put out every year for the last 6 years. But of course, as you can imagine, the year 2020 report focused heavily on the effects of the pandemic. So while I will not be, bringing up any schematics onto the screen, I will provide a link to that report towards the end of the conversation if you'd like to peruse that separately. What I would like to call attention to in that report is presented in what they're calling Exhibit 4. And it's the conclusion that since the pandemic, mothers who are part of a dual career couple, so in other words, that they're both working, are twice as likely as fathers who are in a dual career couple to spend 5 more hours per day on chores. 5 more hours per day. And of course, that statistic is broken out into a couple of subcategories. The first one being men and women without children. The second one is mothers and fathers in general, overall. And then the subcategory, third one, is men and women with children under the age of 10. And it should really come at no surprise that it's really that third subcategory where those differences in percentages really start to jump out of the page and become evident, where women are seeing an additional 5 hours of chores per day. So, you might be asking, how are women dealing with this burden, those additional 5 hours? Well, the unfortunate reality, which is presented in Exhibit 5 of that report, points out that approximately 1 in 3 mothers have considered leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers because of that burden. And specifically, actually 17% of women with kids considered downshifting their careers versus 23% of women with kids leaving the workforce entirely. And of course, citing childcare responsibilities as a primary reason or consideration. So, I found those conclusions to be pretty significant, and I certainly encourage you to keep those in mind as this conversation develops. And again, I'll link the article in the text box towards the end of the conversation. So that brings me to our discussion topic number one. As an engineer, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge a baseline on what life looked like just prior to the impact. So could I ask the three of you to please give us an idea about the demands of being an attorney versus your home life prior to March 2020? And in other words, what types of sort of life parameters or variables were you managing prior to the start of the pandemic? Joanna, could I ask you to kick us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I guess I've always sort of prided myself on being able to quote unquote do it all, but that always involves a lot of help. And I think most professional women will say that you can't do it all alone, that's for sure. I have two boys who are age 17 and 15. And I had the first one while I was on maternity leave, having the first child. I was promoted to partner at the firm. I did go to a reduced hours schedule for a while at the firm in order to kind of juggle having young kids. My second child came along and was born unexpectedly with very severe disabilities. He has a rare genetic syndrome, and at age 15 still does not walk or talk and is an absolute sweetheart, but definitely has needed a lot, always has to have one-on-one care. He absolutely has to have someone with him at all times. So that presented its own challenges. And then by the time he was a year and a half, I was divorced from my husband. So ever since then, for the last 14 or so years, I've been a single parent to these two kiddos. And it worked because I was focused on my career, focused on my home life, asked for help when I needed it, always had an au pair or a nanny, and we just kind of sorted through it. I had backup babysitters, I had some family support to pitch in when needed, and then I relied very heavily on the school system. Once the kids were back in school, once they were in school full time at the age where that was appropriate, I was able to resume my career on a full-time basis, and was promoted to equity partner and have been able to really focus on my career. But it wasn't until the pandemic hit that I realized that I had built kind of a house of cards for myself that was very carefully balanced. And the foundation of that house of cards was the school system. And I relied so heavily on the school taking care of the kids for a majority of my working day. And I had nannies and au pairs who would help before school, help after school. As with probably all of us, I always had lots of events at night. I traveled for work. But the school system, provided 30 or 40 hours of daycare essentially per week. And then I just had to fill in the rest. So that was a huge, huge problem when the pandemic hit. And I know you were asking about pre-pandemic life, but I'll just delve into how my house of cards fell apart at the seams and we were shaken to the foundation, which is obvious because it happened to all of us. All of a sudden the schools were closed, and this was fine for my older son, who's a senior in high school, just graduated from high school. He could totally handle it. And I tell him all the time, he handled it better than anyone else in the house. My wonderful nanny agreed to step in and work days to help with my younger son with the disabilities. But, she was juggling plenty of stress and other things in the pandemic as well. And so I couldn't ask her to work more than 40 or 50 hours a week. And that, quite frankly, was just not enough to cover what was needed at work, especially with clients absolutely panicking about what COVID meant for their businesses, all the force majeure claims coming in. All of a sudden, I was kind of a quasi litigator like Tiffany, trying to figure out what we were going to do under all of these contracts. And that was super stressful. And I didn't have enough daycare without the schools in place. And my younger son was not able to do anything on Zoom learning and was very miserable because he didn't understand while he wasn't going to school. So he started having more physical challenges, anxiety challenges. After 8 months of this or so, I started having health problems. Everything just really fell apart. So I would love to be able to stand in front of you today and say, like, this is how I did it, and it was amazing and we conquered it all. I did not. Like, I kept my head above water at work and, helped my clients as needed and got through the year, but it was hell on this earth. I will just be honest about that.
Joanna, thank you so much for that insight. It takes a lot to voice a lot of those variables as transparently as you've done, and I certainly do appreciate it. Nicole, would you like to continue with a bit of a background on what your life looked like prior to the pandemic?
Sure. Just as a baseline, I mean, I didn't mention it in my intro, but I have an 11-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. I am married. My spouse happens to be a US Congressperson. So our life pre-pandemic was a bit of single mother, really 3 weeks out of the month when he travels to DC, at least pre-pandemic. He would get on a plane on Monday and come back on Thursday. During those particular days, I'm fortunate enough that my mother actually moved to Phoenix maybe 10 years ago at this point. And so she is really the person who smooths out all of those rough edges. As Joanna mentioned, obviously you can't do this alone. If it wasn't my mother, it would be someone else that I would be paying money to help me out. Both of my kids are involved in sports. And because I'm in Arizona, baseline really didn't change a lot once the pandemic hit, because Arizona only really shut down for about 2 weeks because of the pandemic. And so the exception to that was schools. And I completely agree with Joanna, and I know we'll get into this more later, but certainly pre-pandemic, I mean, during those school hours, I was footloose and fancy free, attentive, 100% to my job. I would drop the kids off at school in the morning, wave goodbye, and really didn't think much about it until it was time for them to be picked up and go to their activities. But that was my baseline, which really was, I look back on it now and I'm not sure how I did it in terms of making sure that everyone is where they're supposed to be. Because when my husband is out of town, he's out of town. Sometimes when I call him, I can't even get him on the phone because he's in an important hearing or something like that. And so you mentioned in the study about chores, I actually think if they're referencing physical things like laundry and cleaning and things like that, those are things obviously that I think are a little bit easier to find people to help you with. What I think particularly falls on women, and this is pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and will be post-pandemic, is all of the, what I'm going to say are administrative things associated with having children, signing them up for camps. I think that, at least in our household, has always fallen to me. Because I know the particular nuances, I think, a little bit better of the kids and what they need and things that they like and don't like. And so I that was our life pre-pandemic, and look forward to hearing from Tiffany.
Thank you, Tiffany. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I just want to say, Ron, I've always told my husband that I do far more than him. So I'm very happy to have a study that backs that up. I appreciate that. I'll make sure and get those exhibits to him. Yeah, just like Nicole and Joanna said, prior to the pandemic, we juggled, right? And I love Joanna's use of the term house of cards, because it really did feel like that. My husband's an engineer at NASA. He works at the International Space Station here in Houston. He has unusual hours sometimes. Sometimes he has to sit console, which means he can be in from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 11 at night, or 11 at night to 7 in the morning. He's also in the Air Force Reserves, which means he's out of town a couple of days a month and then 2 weeks a year. And so in addition to the long hours that I work, of course, my job requires quite a bit of travel. So we have, at least pre-pandemic, travel for depositions, hearings, site visits, that sort of thing. And we really have to coordinate schedules. We don't have any family that lives close by. So our school system, our daycare system, and a couple of key people that we have available to help fill in the gaps were very, very important. But by the time, so as I said, my kids are 5 and 8 now. They'll be turning 6 and 9 in September. By the time they were 5 and 8, we had a system in place, right? Everyone knew where they were going. We knew how to coordinate. Everybody knew the drill. And as Joanna said, we soon found that that was kind of a house of cards, because once that one support system, the schools, fell out of place, it all just kind of came crashing down, and really had to rethink how we do everything.
Thank you, Tiffany. Certainly an incredible array of perspectives and variables in each of your three lives. So we've already started to touch on this already, but we can logically kind of segue directly to the time of impact now. So my second question, if you'd like to add anything to what you've already stated, is, at the start of the pandemic, what new challenges, be it school system or otherwise, were you observing or encountering? And how did this play into, what was sort of the play between your work life versus your personal lives, such as your children and their schooling? Nicole, what was going on in Arizona? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, sure. I mean, if you look historically on the pandemic timeline, there were 2 periods of time in Arizona where the positivity rate for COVID-19 was the worst in the entire world. And I do think that's largely attributable to the fact that we didn't do a shutdown of really any magnitude. It really was for 2 weeks. But as I said, the school system did shut down. People's offices obviously shut down on their own volition. And so, March 2020, my kids and I were scheduled to go on a spring break trip to the East Coast. And that trip was canceled, and I never went back into the office until August of 2020. I went into the office for about 45 minutes to conduct our annual shareholder meeting, and that was it. For my kids, I think that their schools were closed. They both engaged, of course, like I'm sure everyone else's kids, in remote learning, which was challenging. My kids are of the age 11 and 14 where they do know how to use electronics. They know how to use the school electronics, but they also know how to use the iPads and the cell phones. So there are a lot of distractions from their ability to stay focused. And so, all of a sudden I'm working at home, they're working at home. Their dad is no longer flying back and forth as regularly to DC because Congress instituted proxy voting, and he was able to stay home. But that didn't mean that everyone's work stopped, of course. And I know that's the same for everybody, is that the work went on. Our kids were still at home. Everyone was looking for their little corner of the house to engage in whatever activity it was that they needed to be doing right at that time. And I think that, I became the one who had to intervene and make sure that when I walked into my son's room, that he was actually doing work and not playing on the PlayStation or texting with his friends on the telephone. And I think for some kids, that's harder than others. Our son happens to have a very significant case of ADHD. So this was, a real challenge to keep our kids focused. And, mealtime, I pretty much had to plan my days around making sure that there was somebody that was available. My husband and I would make sure there was somebody able to make lunch for our kids. And as you mentioned, Saron, in Arizona, although the state never shut down everything, businesses, of course, took it upon themselves to shut down. And so effectively, a lot of things were shut down. I think, ironically, because our kids pre-pandemic were involved in a lot of activities that did end up shutting down during the pandemic, our lives actually calmed down a little bit in some respects because we weren't running our kids to basketball practices twice a week and things like that. So it's like squeezing a balloon in certain ways. Like some parts of it deflated, but then other parts of it, as Joanna has highlighted, really became much more difficult. That time period at home when you're trying to juggle, your kid popping up in the background when you're trying to be on a Zoom call and things like that, and just training everyone that this is kind of the new normal. This is not a 2-week stint. Like, this is going to be going on for a significant period of time.
Absolutely. I think, Nicole, the operative word that you highlighted in that last sentence is training. It certainly is a process of learning. Absolutely. So I agree with that. And Tiffany, I guess something similar to that was happening in Texas in terms of shutdown. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it was pretty similar in Texas insofar as the amount of shutdown that was happening here. Now, I'll say Texas really didn't get into kind of their first wave of high caseloads and hospitals filling up, I think, until maybe late June, early July. So in March here, just like Nicole said, we were on spring break, right? And we get toward the end of spring break and we get this announcement that the schools aren't going to open back up. And I just remember feeling such shock and disbelief. And then, but I felt certain we'll just be a couple of weeks and then we'll be fine. We'll be back to school. No problem. And then it kept extending. And then finally they just said, we're closing for the rest of the calendar year. And I still just remember being really shocked and not really knowing what that was going to mean. And so the first thing we do as lawyers is organize, schedule, make calendars, get everybody in their place, and try to find some sort of routine for managing this. And that's what we did. You know, we tried to, organize and schedule the day so that the kids could get some sort of schooling, and we could also do some sort of work. By the time we got to, I think by the time online schooling was done, and for us in Texas, that's usually mid-May, we had decided to send the kids back to Primrose, which was the daycare that they had been at prior to school. And like I said, we weren't really in a full first wave here in Texas. The daycare Primrose had been open for the duration to essential workers. They had really strict measures in place. They had not had any issues. And, we looked within our family at our risk tolerance and really the difficulties the boys were having with being at home. We didn't have playgrounds available to them. They weren't playing with anyone. They were really just kind of in the house. We would go for a walk every once in a while, and they were having a hard time with it. And so we decided as a family, look, we will bubble to the best extent that we can. We'll send them, let them go to school, let them have some socialization. We'll monitor, we'll see how things go. And so we did that during that summer, and I don't know what we would have done otherwise, quite honestly. And so even with them at out of the house during that time, just having my husband and I both in the same house when we're both trying to work and competing for office space was also kind of overwhelming. We have one office and he would go in and do some conferences, and then I would go in and do some conferences, and it was never really set up for the both of us to kind of work from home. He still works from home right now. NASA's still not letting people back.
Well, certainly sharing an office space with your spouse is something that resonates with me and a daily struggle for my household as well. So I can certainly appreciate that. Joanna, what did your, scramble to find a new routine look like in Chicago? I'm assuming that was a very drastically different perspective on your end.
Yeah, it was. And I would like to say that I was super organized about planning out some routine, but it was more just like desperate grabs at whoever could help. And my nanny and her husband were wonderful and did agree to bubble with our family and help us out. And I couldn't have survived without her. Like, I literally would have had to take a leave of absence from my job if I didn't have someone who could care for my disabled child. And I was just sort of, like Tiffany, in shock that it went on for so long because I hadn't mentally prepared myself for that. And in Chicagoland, given that kind of the political atmosphere and culture here, it was very locked down, and people kind of policed each other to make sure you're staying at home. And the school situation is so interesting to me to reflect back upon. Like, probably not worthwhile to talk too much about pandemics because hopefully none of us ever go through this again. But I did think this is a little bit crazy that the schools are not letting kids go back to school. So my disabled child was out of school for 10 months, and the older one was out of school for longer, but he was able to do work on the Zoom learning. And I look at, like, I have family in France, and they are still more locked down in France than we are here in Chicago, but their children, school-age children, almost never stopped going to school. They were probably out of school for a couple weeks. And I think there's a different cultural attitude there toward working parents. You know, there you get state-funded daycare, you get a lot of accommodations for working parents. There's a recognition that if children are not in school, parents can't work. And I felt there was just a little bit of a bizarre mismatch in this country, particularly in areas like Chicago, between wanting to support working families and particularly working poor, and not, you know, finding a way to get kids into school when that is the primary way that working parents cover daycare needs for their children. So that's not totally responsive to your question. It's just something that I hope we do some thinking about as a society coming out of this. This can't happen again. We cannot take away schools from kids for this long of a period of time. I get we weren't prepared for this and nobody had a playbook, but it's wrong on so many levels, and it's going to take us years to recover from this.
Absolutely. It's interesting to see sort of the, you know, the unique situations that our geography presents to us in being based in various states that have different approaches to dealing with the schooling system and in general businesses and the pandemic. So I'd like to continue onward with our third discussion point. We've set the stage, we've established a background, we've talked about the initial effects. Let's discuss what, further discuss what our current situation presents, especially from the work front. My question to you is, what are some of the strategies that you or your company implemented as you began to acclimate to these new circumstances? And what did this process look like? Tiffany, could you kindly start that conversation?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this question, I really found it initially, it felt like everyone was kind of in this foxhole mentality, right? We're all in this together. There were lawyers that I knew that hadn't struggled with childcare issues either because their children were grown, or they had a spouse who generally took care of childcare issues. But now they were, I don't want to say locked in their house, but they were in the house with the kids, and they were having to kind of struggle with these competing priorities. And there were some partners that I know whose adult children actually moved in and bubbled with them so that they could have access to childcare with either the partner or the partner spouse. And there was a real sense of, early on, I think there was a real sense of empathy and compassion in our profession that I hadn't really seen before, and an understanding of, you've got your kids there. They may pop in your Zoom. They may, someone's cat may run across the screen. And it was a sense that we are getting a look into each other's homes, into our lives. And sometimes you saw people's bedrooms, sometimes their children. It was very raw initially. Now, we did not, at Jones Walker, we did not close our doors and prohibit anyone from going into the office, but we were strongly, strongly encouraged not to go in. And far and away, most everyone did not go in. In the Houston office, I was one of two partners that would come in, and I only came in a couple days a week. I learned that throughout this process that I can work from home just fine, but after a day or two, I start to get a little restless, and so I never really set up fully at home. I didn't get my own office space. I didn't, set up my super duper computer. I was always working on a laptop at home and having to move about the house. So I never really got comfortable working from home. And I would get restless after 2 or 3 days and end up coming into the office just to kind of feel at home and organized and be able to think more clearly. So those were the strategies that I had, which was, kind of get the kids situated, which we were able to do, spend some modest amount of time at home to lessen the load on, people coming into the office, and obviously being respectful of that. And then have some time, 2 or 3 days, where I could refocus and regroup kind of quietly in my office without anybody here.
Mm. And Nicole, how does that differ from sort of an in-house counsel experience?
Well, I mean, I oversee 6 lawyers, 7 at the time that the pandemic started. And we all, of course, started working remotely. Our headquarters were shut down. Our business in most of the states that we operate in fact, I can't think of one that it wasn't, was considered an essential business because in many states where we operate, cannabis is still under a medical regime. And so therefore we were treated like pharmacies. And so the legal work was, probably more vigorous than it was even pre-pandemic. And so for me, the strategies that I had to implement were, you know, being remote, but yet making sure that people were highly responsive because things were changing. At least for us, we are customer facing, we have retail locations. And so they were open and we were dealing with states and localities. In California, it was city by city, things changing on sometimes a daily basis as to what we could and couldn't do. So for my team in implementing those strategies, and of course the legal team interfaces with most every department within the company, I think we really set the tone early on in terms of being responsive. Just because you're at home doesn't mean that you have the flexibility to kind of just shut off or shut down. We don't work 8 to 5 or 8 to 4, whatever. Our team had to be responsive 24/7 during that time period. And I do think that that really set the tone for, a continued ability, even coming out of the pandemic. I know our next topic is going to be kind of looking forward, but I was a skeptic going into remote work, honestly. I'd never done it myself before. We had a couple of lawyers on the team who liked working at home, and I was always a little bit suspicious about that. When I was managing the lawyers at the law firm, I was certainly suspicious about it there. But I think this experience has really created the opportunity for people like me who were suspicious about it and a little skeptical to really understand how productive people can be if managed appropriately and expectations are set appropriately to be very productive in this environment. And so, our team, I think, will continue to operate remotely in some respects after the pandemic ends.
Certainly, I do echo that conclusion that we've all gained a sense or heightened sense of empathy uh, or humanity throughout all of this. Absolutely. And finally, Joanna, how does that compare with sort of your experience at a large law firm?
Yeah, so it was definitely panic mode at the beginning, as we're all trying to figure out what this means for us. And because we're a global law firm, we saw it coming going in waves through our various international offices. Like, we have a large presence in Asia, and we saw, what was happening there before it hit in Europe and then hit in the United States. So that helped us maybe get ahead of the curve a little bit. But it was, very stressful for everybody, particularly the partners who are worried about keeping the firm afloat and worrying about their own livelihood as well as all the people that work with us. The firm did a really nice job and did some very innovative things. We did implement pay cuts right away, right across the board. But later in the year, when we were able to get a grip on cutting other expenses and looking like the year was going to be healthy, we reinstated everyone's pay with back pay. I was very proud of that. I actually cried when I saw the memo because you just feel awful to be having people take a pay cut when we're all suffering so greatly. And we also offered, which I thought was rather innovative, a sabbatical program for our attorneys below the equity partner level, where people could voluntarily take up to a 12-week sabbatical. And we offered this in a couple waves, where they were not required to work at all and they would still get 25% of their pay. Or if they wanted to put in a certain amount of pro bono time, they could get an even increased amount of their pay. And I did know some people who took advantage of that. And that works if you can live off, a little portion of your salary and you don't have others depending on your salary. So it was helpful. We did have a number of people who took advantage of that. But I think, I just had this overwhelming feeling constantly where, usually probably in any of our organizations, when someone's going through a tough time or someone needs time off because they're struggling with something, the rest of us pitch in and the rest of us put in some extra time. And I just hated, not being able to do that for my colleagues because I was so thinly strung as it was, like just trying to get through my day and get the bare minimum done. We kept telling each other as partners, you got to check in on people and make sure everybody's still engaged and everybody still feels okay. And I just honestly felt like I can barely just get through everything I need to do in the day. I'm not being a good partner. I'm not being a good support system for other people. And that just made me sad. I still think about that a lot. Like I wish I could have told this particular person I work with closely, who was just really having to do way too much, that she just didn't have to do it, that, you know, just go take a month off and I can do it for you. But there was nobody to pick up her slack, and she didn't slack. So I think that was just so hard. We were all in it together. We were all in the foxhole. We're trying our hardest to support other people. And some people had more bandwidth, but most people didn't have extra bandwidth. And I think, you know, that will kind of bring me to the thoughts that I wanted to share in the next topic that we were planning to speak about, which is sort of the post-COVID environment. And now what the hell do we do with this?
Absolutely. No, and I think it's interesting about your firm's sabbatical program. I mean, mental health and mental awareness is certainly more and more part of everyone's vocabulary, which I'm quite pleased to see. But frankly, that's quite forward thinking, and it seems like something that a lot of European countries are doing quite effectively, and perhaps we don't see as much of that in the U.S. So it's wonderful to see sort of the beginnings of that awareness and the need for just taking time away from your desk and your work to look after yourself and whatever you may need. So thank you for that, Joanna. As we've discussed, perhaps the most important takeaway from this conversation is going to be what we should be considering going forward into the future. And I think it was Joanna who said that hopefully we will never have to go through a pandemic ever again. But in the event that we do, these are the types of things that we hope to be implementing into our work lives as well as our personal lives, having been through an array of these challenges throughout the course of last year and certainly into this year. So I'll kind of break it out into some subtopics of what I think may be the most relevant aspects of going into the future. First of all, we need to reintegrate into a quote unquote normal professional life and really recognize that transition. Joanna, you indicated that you might have something to say about that.
Yes, thank you. I always have lots to say about everything, but yeah, if I may kind of share a personal vignette about reintegrating into personal life first, because to me, it really got me thinking about myself and how I'm reacting to things. As I said, we were on serious lockdown in Chicago. And then all of a sudden, I never would have believed it would happen so quickly. But, the other cultural thing in Chicagoland is people were, lined up for days to get vaccines. And so all of a sudden people were getting access to vaccines, and over this spring, now everybody I know, all my friends, kids, my kids, all of us vaccinated. And all of a sudden it feels like real life can resume much more suddenly than I ever expected. People always said it's not going to be like turning a switch. It actually felt like it around here. And so as I mentioned, my older son just graduated from high school a couple weeks ago, and I would not have believed that we would be having large parties, that he would be having a live graduation in this area, given what we went through in the last year. But lo and behold, we did. We were invited to a large outdoor party on Friday night. We had the graduation on the Saturday, and we had dinner and saw friends. And then we hosted a party on the Sunday. And the weird thing is, you would think I would just be like overwhelmingly happy, because this is all I had been praying for while, we were in lockdown and my son was so miserable. I just felt weird. I felt very exhausted by the time Sunday night came around, very drained. And I realized, I think I'm not used to socializing like I used to. That would have been maybe a typical weekend previously. And now I felt very out of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started talking to friends about it, who said they've had these very weird emotional roller coasters lately. And it seems strange because shouldn't we just be happy? We're back to normal. But I think we have to recognize it's actually going to take some time. And I think there is, as I've talked about, I've felt personally traumatized and had some health issues based on everything that happened over the last year. And that's just not going to go away just because I can go to parties again and I can go back in the office and kind of have my normal life. And so I am thinking about, if I'm feeling this way, how is that colleague of mine feeling who I talked about before? And I don't want to put expectations on her and others that you have to bounce back into the office and we're back to normal. And now let's just pretend all of that didn't happen. I think it's important to spend time integrating people at their speed into what activities and things they want to do live, and just being really mindful of it was like we went through a war together, and we have to recognize that there is going to be some trauma, and it can't just be all about like, okay, work, work, work. Let's make sure our profits are at pre-pandemic levels. We've got to take care of each other now in order to avoid what you started the session with these horrible statistics about women, particularly with children, leaving the workplace. Now, I think when I now finally have that time, when I can spend time checking on my colleagues and I feel more settled, I'm trying to promise myself that I'll do that. Now is the time that I have to make sure that these other people don't leave because this was so traumatic.
Mm. I completely agree with your, your view on the awkwardness of those social interactions. Personal speaking, sometimes, every conversation kind of feels like you're talking to your 8th grade crush again. You have nerves, you don't know how to behave. It's very interesting, very awkward at times, certainly. Let's continue on with the idea of remote working flexibility. The flexibility to be able to work from home or come into the office if you prefer will always continue to be a significant determinant of how women set that balance or find that, or refine that balance. So in fact, Tiffany, referring to an article, a Bloomberg article that you shared earlier with me this week, it actually stated that 84% of survey participants listed not having to commute as a top benefit for remote workers. And I thought that was interesting. And it was, several levels above the percentage listed for childcare responsibilities. Is there anything that you'd like to offer, any insight you'd like to offer on that, or anything else with regard to
Yeah.
remote working flexibility?
I do think that's really interesting. Coming from someone who has an hour and 40-minute commute a day, I drew the short straw, and we live down by NASA, and so I have to commute into the office. I don't know that. So the commute is one thing as far as the remote work, but I think there is a general sense that people can live in different places. Even like it's the question that we have going forward, I think, and it was in that article, Saran, that I sent you. It was in a podcast that I listened to. I mean, it is on the top of everyone's mind right now. What do we do now that we know that we can really function at a high level, like Nicole was saying, with remote work? And I think everyone is struggling with what that means. There are thoughts that no, we really need to maintain the firm culture, or we need our business culture. We need to have everybody in. Everybody needs to be seeing each other and working together. I had someone who I consider probably the best mentor I've ever had just kind of tell me the other day she had a really hard time filling her mentor bucket being remote. It wasn't the same as being in the office and stopping in and seeing new associates. It wasn't the same as being able to take people out to lunch. She had a really hard time really filling that role, she felt. I still think she was a fantastic mentor, but it was something that she had personally kind of reflected on. And so the question is, particularly because I think women will find remote work more attractive than most people, notwithstanding the commute. I mean, who knows, maybe the commute is tied to the fact that women can't make it to their children's soccer games or any number of things that is related to children and families. So I do think it is an easier way to manage that work-life balance. And so it is something that I think women are going to consider. And I know Joanna mentioned early on she had an alternative work schedule. I think that works really great for women, particularly right after they've had children and want to spend a little more time in their career at home. The thing that I think concerns me is that mentoring access. If you were to be fully remote all the time, building the relationships in the firm, particularly early on in your career, being able to develop business early on in your career. So those are just thoughts that we need to be on the lookout for, be accounting for. I think considering working from the office at least 1 or 2 days a week, particularly if there are big meetings happening, firm-wide meetings and stuff, is probably going to be, I just don't see us going full remote all the time.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to explore the, that team building or team leading aspect a little bit further in those relationships. Nicole, can you offer some thoughts on how you have, through this acquisition process, managed some of those strategies to effectively lead or build your team?
Yeah, I mean, I actually feel a little bit differently about it. And it could be because I'm outside of the law firm setting, because I do think, having grown up in a large law firm, having that face to face, that kind of being seen, that mentoring is very important. But at least in Harvest and in the legal department specifically, I think I took it upon myself to really spend a lot of time each week with my team on the phone, via Zoom, face to face. And I actually feel like I know my team members both personally better and professionally better. I will be happy if we never have to come back to the office. I've said that. I certainly have people who could go and pick up my kids from school at 3 o'clock, my daughter specifically. But during the pandemic, when her school did open up this spring, um, because I was working remotely, I could take calls in the car while I'm waiting in the car line. No one cared where I was. And I think that for women, at least in a corporate setting, the people that I work for on our management team, they're concerned about results. And so I've never been a fan when I was at a law firm, and certainly when I was managing the office, I was not a fan of happy hours and big law firm happy hours and team building through happy hours. I think that's very difficult for women who either have the child pick up responsibilities or want to be the ones who pick up their children. And so being in a corporate setting, for us, it's about results. And our management team looks at what we've been able to accomplish over the past 12, almost 15 months now. And we're getting results, we're productive. And I think that because of those things, at least our team is thriving in a remote work situation. We don't have the obligations of going out and getting clients. I certainly wouldn't want to be doing that during a pandemic and trying to figure out how to grow your practice. I've done that. I was a partner at a big firm, and I can't imagine how difficult that is in this environment. But I think it's situational. And if anything, COVID has taught us, it's that everyone's reaction to the pandemic was very individualized. And as someone who manages people, you do have to treat your team and the people that you work with in a very individualized way on this. Everyone's circumstances are just so different.
I absolutely agree with that, Nicole, wholeheartedly. And on that, perhaps we can just quickly touch, it's getting very close to the top of the hour, but perhaps we could just quickly touch on, managing those expectations. It's both in and out of the office and everything in between. Joanna, can I defer to you to offer some insight on that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting process. And there's, I'm involved in a lot of discussions within our firm, and I was speaking to a client this morning about sort of how is this going to look going forward. I think, it will be an unusual business that doesn't allow more flexibility post COVID. I think I've heard about some law firms that are out there recruiting and trying to recruit away from other law firms candidates by saying you can work 100% remote. Now, the fine print there is it's not a partnership track position. And I think that's where we see issues in the law firm is I think by all means, we can and should accommodate more remote work flexibility. But I think there is just a reality, at least in the current model of law firms, that there is some real benefit in being in the office also and learning side by, actually sitting in a partner's office on the conference call with them, where you can sidebar with the person and explain where you're going to go next in a negotiation or something like that. And then I think for associates and junior attorneys, you often get work assignments just sort of ad hoc because you are there, you do run into somebody, you say, oh, I'd love to get involved in XYZ with you. So I think, there will be a fine line between, what is expected of people, what's required, what's allowed. We're struggling with that as a firm right now, and I don't envy the people who actually have to make the decision. And so then and we're, starting to get into the place with, as I said, the graduation festivities were live. Well, we have summer associates this summer, and they're all remote, but they are doing some optional live activities. They are getting them together for a happy hour if they'd like to. And I am going to go and have lunch with a summer associate, which will be so nice, because I don't feel that same connection. To the point about the mentor who doesn't feel like you can mentor properly over a Zoom, I feel more connected with people in person, and I think that's good for client relationships as well. And so but I think that, the etiquette will be, I wasn't sure, would this summer associate only want to sit outside at a restaurant, or would she want to sit inside? Just navigating how you bring that up without putting somebody on the spot is like a new world order. And so I made her choose. I said, I'm comfortable doing anything. You choose where you'd like to go out of these choices. And, would you prefer indoor, outdoor? So, and, preferring people, if you're going to be doing these Zoom calls, which I feel like, well, now we're all doing so many Teams and Zoom and WebEx and blah, blah, blah. I think that's here to stay. And that's actually super nice when you're not in the same location as a client or a colleague. You get much more connectivity if you can't actually be together. But then there's all the etiquette around you. You're supposed to have your camera off, your camera on, you kind of, the more senior people maybe shame the more junior people into putting their cameras on when they don't want to. So it's a new world order that we're going to still have to continue to navigate even as we come out of this. And so sorry, there's no answers in that answer. They're just just more
No,
issues.
but equally poignant and so true. I mean, it's really finding that balance between being responsible, but also being respectful and acknowledging that everyone is different in their preferences. So deferring to another in the case that you are feeling comfortable with all possibilities is a wonderful strategy. I think that's certainly something to take away. I'd like to round out this conversation with one question that I've received, and that is that a lot of emphasis is placed on the burden of childcare, and often people neglect to consider the burden of parental care. What advice might you have for individuals who are dealing with the stigma that they don't have kids, so they can't possibly understand the struggle? Is there
Yes.
anyone that would like to offer some thoughts on that?
I don't know that I have thoughts on that, but I definitely thought about that in preparing, because I do think we do have kind of this understanding of women in the workforce and the childcare burdens. And I don't have elderly parents that I'm dealing with yet, but it won't be long. And I do think that the people that I know who have those care issues, their time is almost as consumed as, I would say, not someone with, small children, but at least as someone who has, teenage children. Like their time is as consumed with that, and it's as challenging to deal with. And I do think we need to recognize that also. I mean, the work-life balance, even if you have pets that are very special to you, or you have a particular passion for running and you want to spend a lot of time doing that, there are numerous things in our lives that are very important that tend to get shoved aside or subsumed by our careers. And I think we would all do well to kind of give them a little more space in our lives to the extent that we can. Now, we have competing priorities. Our priorities are to our clients, and we need to make sure that those priorities are met. But I think we serve our clients better when we are human beings and not just automatons churning out legal briefs.
That's an excellent point indeed. I do appreciate that, Tiffany. Thank you. And that brings us right to the top of the hour. And I guess I just would like to, again, thank you, Tiffany, Nicole, and Joanna. I cannot thank you enough, actually, for taking the time out of your day to share this insight with us. I'll certainly be ruminating on a couple of points that have come up during the conversation. And again, I'd like to thank Rob and the ABA Forum on Construction Law for hosting us, as well as all of my colleagues from HKA for making this conversation possible. Rob, I'll go ahead and give it back to you.
Thank you all. I'll spare you the video and just again say thanks to Seyran and the panel. It was an awesome conversation and a wonderful discussion. So much appreciated On behalf of the forum, thanks to our attendees for coming, and again to the panel and to HKA for sponsoring. And again, a big shout out as well to the ABA staff, Tamara, LaShonda, and Colleen Hardison for their work in bringing this together. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.